I had this naive idea after my book on ADD came out, scattered in the States, scattered mind. People say, wow, we finally get it. But in the ADD world, they don't want to touch it. They don't want, now the book's a bestseller in Canada and it's doing very well in the States, but no thanks to the official organizations that they don't even want to hear it because they think I'm blaming the parent. They want to believe that it's a genetic disease. Because if it's a genetic disease, then we don't have to look at anything. We can just medicate. ADD is another coping mechanism. To go back to that Harvard study I mentioned earlier, and they're reported in pediatrics, children's response to early stress, adaptive responses that help them survive the stress, later become sources of pathology. Now, when I was diagnosed with ADD myself at age 54, it was really helpful to me because I understood a lot of things about myself. At least I thought I understood. At least I saw described about myself in a pattern that I hadn't ever considered in any way represented some kind of a dynamic in me. So it was very helpful to me to be diagnosed and to be self-diagnosed primarily and then have that confirmed. But from the beginning, I didn't buy into the idea that it was a genetic disease. Not for a second. Because tuning out, which is the hallmark of ADD, the absent-mindedness, is not a disease. It's actually a coping mechanism. It's one of the brain's coping mechanisms. When the stress is too much, and we can't fight back, escape, or ask for help, then one of the ways the brain deals with it is to tune it out. It's a form of disassociation. It's a form of dissociation. It's or what has been called divided attention. So that's a coping mechanism, and that was clear to me. So when you look at a condition like ADD, the diagnosis of which is just going up leaps and bounds every few years, when the number of prescriptions are going up, in the States there are 3 million kids on stimulant medications, 500,000 on antipsychotic medications, many of them for ADHD, not because they're psychotic, but because their impulse control is so poor, and we're so bereft of understanding child development that we have to sedate them instead of helping them. When you get these numbers going up all the time, it can't be genetic because genes don't change in a population over a few years. Nor is it just that we're recognizing it more. Really, it's that we have more and more kids who are just lacking impulse control and lacking the capacity to pay attention. Well, why? Well, if we understand that tuning out, divided attention, disassociation is a coping mechanism, then the question we have to ask is, what's stressing these kids so much that they have to respond that way? And if we ask that question, we can no longer look at DNA. Now we have to look at what's happening in those kids' lives. Well, their parents are more stressed. The village, the clan, the neighborhood, the tribe, that safe holding environment where children had many nurturing adults to relate to, uncles and aunts, is gone. The parents themselves have less support, and both parents are having to work, so parents don't even see the kids the whole day. So kids are very stressed. And of course kids, especially if they're very sensitive, they absorb their parents' stresses, like I did as a Jewish infant in the ghetto of Budapest under Nazi occupation in Hungary in 1944. How does an infant deal with that stress? Can't fight back, can't ask for help, can't run away. You tune it out. But when are you tuning it out? You're tuning out when the brain is developing. So there's this astonishing brain developmental data that's not even vaguely controversial, that has been fully established now in the last few decades, that the brain develops under the impact of the environment. When the environment is stressed, then the tuning out, which is a coping mechanism, goes from a temporary state, becomes wired into the brain as a long-term trait. So we go from state to a trait. Now we have 8 years later, or 54 years later, a person who's diagnosed with ADD. Why? Because their initial environment was so stressed, not because the parents didn't love them, it's not a question of blaming anybody, not because the parents didn't do their best, but because they themselves are so stressed that the child dealt with the stress in the environment by tuning out when their brain was developing. And furthermore, when the dopamine circuits dopamine being the incentive, motivation, attention chemical, which we supplement with Ritalin or dexedrine later on, if we diagnose these people, those dopamine circuits don't develop well when the environment is totally stressed. So it's a perfect storm that we're creating in our society by stressing parents, by cutting asunder the ties of culture, tribe, clan, village, extended family, so neither children or parents have that supportive context. And no wonder you're going to have more kids with troubled brains. It's very simple, both psychodynamically in terms of the need to tune out, and then in terms of the brain development. And then along comes the pharmaceutical industry and says, here's what we can do. We can suppress the symptoms by increasing dopamine levels, by giving these kids these medications, which may or may not be okay in individual cases, but it does nothing for brain development. It does nothing for the child's psychological growth. Nothing. It simply is a suppressing of a symptom. Conceptually, it's obvious. Scientifically, it's the only reasonable case to be made, and yet people are invested in not seeing it. And yet I find that I get a lot of emails and a lot of people and me to parents who are just so thankful for having been given that perspective, that if they work on their attachment relationship with the child, if they're attuned to their children, if they pay attention to their children in a way that the child needs, that the child's symptoms can abate and the children can undergo tremendous growth. So it's people are actually open to it. Now, some people are not. Some people are just not ready to look at themselves, so they just want the child medicated. But a lot of parents are actually, I mean, as a parent, how would most people rather see their kids as being genetically flawed and doomed to this condition to all their lives? Or would they rather understand that the child's brain condition is a response to early stress that the parents unwittingly passed on to their child, but which can be mitigated and new development can still overcome it, or in many ways alleviate it, if we do not provide the right conditions. As a parent, which message would you rather hear? That there's something you can do, or your kid is genetically doomed, here's a pill. And which would you rather hear? And naturally, many people would rather hear the message that, yeah, our stress has contributed to this, we couldn't help it, we did our best, but now that we understand it, we can actually do something differently. And I find that both teachers and parents are very open to the message when they hear it. It's only that they don't hear it from too many people. In the ADD world, of all the books out there, mine is the only one that ever goes to the model of brain development and stress. Any parent who's got a child with any problems at all already feels a tremendous sense of responsibility and self-blame. So for some people then to hear that actually, you know what, yes, it was your stresses that did play a huge role in the development of your child's problems, is devastating. So they'd rather hear that it's genetic. So the genetic theory is very comforting to a lot of people. Because they don't understand, they don't hear the part that it wasn't their fault. Because they actually did their best. And what they're reacting out themselves as parents is the stuff that happened to them as kids. Nor are we blaming their parents, because what was true for them is also true for their parents. So we're talking about multi-generational, transpersonal, and culturally imposed stress and trauma. And there's no individual to blame. So there's those studies where you can look at the child strange situation, where at 1 year of age, you submit a child to the presence of a stranger in the absence of the parent, and the parent comes back in, and whether the child can be soothed by the parent, or whether the child remains anxious or disconnected from the parent. And how the child responds tells us everything about the ability of that parent to have connected with the child emotionally, attuned to the child in the child's first year of life. And that strange situation, how the child responds at 1 year to the same situation, will predict very often how well they do in school or in life. a decade later or decades later. And then you can do the adult attachment into you that tells us about a parent's or an adult's relationship to the attachment figures in their lives when they were children. And then you have this amazing correlation where you can do an adult attachment into you on somebody who's not even a parent yet, and how they respond on the parent, on the adult attachment into you will predict how their unconceived child will years later respond in a strange situation at 1 year of age. Then we can see how impersonal these factors are, non-personal they are. They affect persons, but they're not personal. They're transgenerational, transpersonal, transmitted patterns. And when you understand that, there's nobody left to blame. But again, in a society that always looks to blame people, that when there's something wrong, we're always looking for somebody to blame. Rather than looking at causes, we're looking at who's the enemy, who's at fault, which is, our approach to foreign policy and everything else in this life. Then when you point out the early environment, people right away perceive that the parents are being blamed. So I've literally had reviewers who've supposedly have read my book, where I talk about very deliberately and as articulately as I can generate about the inappropriateness of blaming parents, about the unscientific invalidity of blaming parents, and they'll flat out say, he blames parents. That's all they can perceive, because they haven't dealt with their own shame and responsibility, so they think that I'm pointing a finger at them. They're just pointing a finger at themselves. But and they don't realize that their attachment to genetic theory is just their way of fending off their self-blame. That actually, on the contrary, I'm saying to them, look, you're not at fault. You did your best. It's not your fault. It's not personal to you. Now, that takes a bit of sophistication. In that sense, the genetic theories are very simple, and therefore they are a relief to a lot of people. They're a relief, and they also leave us at a dead end.